Welcome back as we continue our study of the book of Romans. We left off this last class going through chapter 14, trying to go through this chapter carefully and maybe at a little slower pace, but trying to make sure we keep some anchor points. That's one of the things that we've been trying to do throughout this quarter is set in place some sort of restraining or boundaries as we're looking at certain verses that constrain the context, because so much of Romans, so much of the difficulty of Romans is where people just move past or brush past some of those constraining verses and take another verse well outside of the context. And so we're harmonizing everything Paul is saying within its immediate context, within the context of the whole of the book of Romans, and of course within the context of everything else Paul would say, as well as the rest of Scripture. And so we're trying to do that as we go through chapter 14 as well. Hopefully this will be our last pre-recorded class, and we're looking forward to being back in our regular classroom setting coming this Sunday. And of course, those will be recorded for those who still will be at home, perhaps, or those who are watching from other places. As we're wrapping up chapter 14, I'm hoping to have a little bit of time left at the end of this chapter to do a little bit of review. We weren't scheduled to have a class this Wednesday, and so that's going to hopefully help us have that little bit of extra time. And then this coming Sunday and next Wednesday, we'll look at chapters 15 and 16 and close out the book. Well, we left off right about verse 14 or so. We looked at verses up through verse 13, and we were talking about the shift of the focus away from the person at the other end of whatever practice it is, whether it be the eating of the meats or whether it be the celebrating of the days. Here I am at one end of that spectrum and somebody's at the other end. And what is my responsibility? My responsibility is not to look at that person with contempt. If I am the one with a stronger conscience, in other words, if I am being more permissive, that is under the umbrella of what God permits, but I'm being more permissive in my behavior than the other person, then contempt is the temptation for me to look at that person with contempt. If I'm the person with a more restrictive behavior, in this context, the weaker conscience, then I'm not to look at my stronger brother with judgment or condemnation. And so that's the terminology we're talking about. So instead of looking at my brother with contempt or condemnation, I need to look at God and recognize that He is the judge, that it's not my job to work out the details that God hasn't given. There are things that God has instructed us on, but these are things that God, well, it's not that He hasn't instructed, but He has permitted. And so in those areas of judgment, matters of judgment, we're not supposed to step in and say, well, this would be best and you really ought to do this. No, leave that brother to make those decisions for himself. That's not our place to make those decisions for him. And so the attention towards God, He is the ruler, He's the king. The quotation here is, I live, says the Lord, in verse 11, every knee shall bow to me and every tongue shall give praise to God. And from Isaiah, which so focuses on that sort of king language of the Messiah. So each one will give an account of himself to God. Therefore, let us not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this, not to put an obstacle or a stumbling block in a brother's way. Now, that is where, as far as looking at all of this in chapter 14, you have the weaker brother, don't condemn. You have the stronger brother, don't look with contempt. But there is a tilt, and we talked about this at the very beginning. The language is towards the stronger brother. The instruction is towards the stronger brother. That doesn't mean that there's no instruction to the weaker brother. We've already talked about that. Don't condemn. However, as we're going down through here, the tilt is towards the stronger brother not to put a stumbling block. All right, so if this is going to cause whatever behavior it is, if this is going to cause your brother to stumble, then the leaning of this text is that the stronger brother, who's more permissive in his behavior, ought to be the one to restrict his behavior rather than the other way. I was at a conference several years ago, and a brother, I think it was David Disselkamp, was explaining it this way. He used the illustration of a circular saw blade, where the blades are turning in one direction. And if you're talking about a saw blade, he illustrated it like this. You can run your hand across the saw blade backwards, in the opposite direction of or in the same direction as the blade would turn away from the blades and or the teeth. And as you run your hand across that blade, you're not going to cut yourself. There's no danger in going this way. But if you run your hand the other way, then you're going to bite in and cut your hand. And so his point was, as we were talking about matters of practice, we were talking about this in the context of institutional, non-institutional questions, and the way we interact socially, the purpose of the church, and so forth. And he said, what would happen if the institutional practicing folks who were there, if they were to stop practicing those things, if they were to stop using the church building for social gatherings, if they were to stop supporting institutions from the church treasury, they would be coming this direction. And if they did, and in fact, several of them said that they did avoid those sorts of things for other reasons, but if they came this way, there would be no harm in coming this way. But now asking us to come that way would certainly harm, because at the very least, we had conscientious objections to doing those things. So the stronger brother can more easily move in the direction of the weaker brother than the weaker brother moving in the direction of the stronger brother. That is a particular concept that I think that needs to be understood here, is that when it comes down to it, it's more possible for the stronger brother to move than the weaker brother. All right. Now, why is that? All right. Beginning in verse 14, we explained a little bit more why that is the case. Okay. So in verse 14, it says, I know and am convinced in the Lord that nothing is unclean in itself, but to him who thinks anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. All right. So the question we have is, why is the food unclean for certain people? And Paul says it is because he thinks it's unclean. Now that is a potentially dangerous concept, that something is, that there's a reality that is based on personal feelings. That sounds like postmodernism, and I don't think Paul is a postmodernist. So how is it the case that something becomes unclean simply because somebody thinks it's unclean? And how far can we take that concept? Well, let me say right off the bat, not very far. All right, this is a very restrictive concept. When we say that something is unclean because someone thinks it's unclean, let's think about this verse in its entirety. Let's start here. I am convinced in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself. Nothing is unclean in itself. Well, what about sexual immorality? Is that unclean? Well, of course it is. And in several places, in several letters, Paul would particularly point to sexual immorality. It was just as much of a problem in the first century as it is today. And Paul certainly thinks that Christians ought to stay away from sexual immorality, that it is impure, it is unclean. So Paul can't mean everything, or that nothing rather, is unclean in the broadest sense of the term nothing. But there must be a more specific way in which he's talking. Well, we've already said in this context that we're talking about things that God has permitted, that he has he is clearly accepted. And so this takes it outside of the realm of moral questions, even doctrinal questions, that God has said clearly, that God has clearly either instructed in the affirmative or the negative. And so Paul is not just sweeping all of that away and saying there's really nothing that's wrong or right in and of itself. That's not the case. But now food. Think about this. Is there any food that in and of itself is unclean? Well, I think from that standpoint, Paul certainly would say, no, there's no food that's unclean. Now you might go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and say, well, now wait a minute. Here's some food that seems to be unclean if it's been offered to idols and if it's being used in the celebration of idols and the worship of idols. But even there, if you look closely, I think you'll see that it's not the food itself that is unclean. In fact, as Paul is instructing, there are some qualifications that he gives wherein that food can be eaten with a completely clean conscience. The problem is not the food. The problem is the effect of eating the food on other people and maybe even yourself. And so he gives those parameters and says, in these cases, eating this food may be harmful. But if you'll look, he's not saying the food itself is unclean. If the food itself was unclean, then it would be unclean whether you knew about its being offered to idols or not. And when he talks about and this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, when he talks about whether or not you know about that, in other words, ask no questions, eat what is sold in the marketplace, ask no questions. But then if you're sitting down with someone and they sort of introduce the meal by saying, this was offered to Aphrodite or Diana, and you hear that, well, then that changes the dynamic. And so because the person who just said that, and because the effect you eating that food might have on the person who just said that, you might say, I'm going to refrain as a result. Well, it doesn't magically change the meat from clean to unclean when they say that. The meat is just the same as it always was. But it changes what might happen conscientiously. The information changes the situation. What we know changes the situation. And so that is the case in so many instances where something may or may not be right or wrong in and of itself, but the audience who's there, who will witness this, there's several things that might change whether or not this thing that we're talking about is right or wrong. It's not the problem. The circumstances may be the problem. And so there might be things that we would participate in depending on who the audience is. Not from a standpoint of hypocrisy, not from a standpoint of here's something that is wrong, but maybe from the standpoint of influence, maybe from the standpoint of harming someone else's conscience. And so we might change our thought processes and change our behavior. I think sometimes when people think of changing your behavior because of the effect it might have on somebody else or the influence you might have, they immediately go to hypocrisy, towards a fakeness, and that's possible. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about care and concern for the conscience of the other person. Now, in thinking about this with verse 13, don't put the stumbling block in another person's way. And then here he says, because this person might think something is unclean. So you see, it's interesting because in the last several verses, we were talking about taking the attention off that person and putting it on God. For the purposes of contempt or condemnation, that is the case. But for the purposes of answering the question as the stronger brother, should I or should I not participate in this thing? I actually do need to put my attention on the other person because it's not the thing itself. A lot of people want to say, look, there's nothing wrong with me doing this. That's not the question. Of course, there's not anything wrong with you doing that. Or maybe there's not anything wrong with you doing that. That's not the question. What effect, what harm, maybe, will this cause your brother? So, from the standpoint of judgment or contempt, making a judgment, passing a judgment, I'm looking towards God. From the standpoint of whether or not I should actually participate in this, I'm looking at my brother. What effect is this going to have? Now, stumbling block. We're not talking about this person prefers not to do that. Sometimes there are brethren who are very strong and convicted, and my participating or doing something is really not going to have a negative effect on them, except maybe they just won't like it. They're not going to be caused to stumble. They're not going to be caused to weaken their resolve or anything like that. But it may be frustrating to them. Sometimes a brother in that circumstance, the frustrated brother, will come to Romans 14 and say, "You're offending my conscience." Well, that is not the context of what Paul is talking about. That's not what an offense is. An offense is not something that happened that you don't like. In the Bible, generally speaking, in the New Testament, when we're talking about offense and causing offense, what we're talking about is causing someone to sin. And so, what you're saying in that instance is you're coming and you're saying, "You are making me sin." Now, that concept of one person making or causing another person to sin is a valid concept. Although, obviously, every person is still responsible for themselves. Someone else can participate and encourage your sin. But I don't think most of the time when people come forward and say, "You're offending me," that they mean you are causing me to act in a guilty way, that you're causing me to actually sin. I think what they really mean is you're hurting my feelings, and you're aggravating me by doing that thing. Well, there's some instruction on doing things that aggravate one another, but it's not in Romans 14. Romans 14 is talking about a person who is going to be harmed, who's going to be spiritually harmed, whose relationship to God is going to be harmed by my behavior. And if that's the case, then what Paul is saying is, I'd rather go without any of my liberties than for that to be the case. So in Corinth, he'd rather decline being paid. He'd rather decline eating. He'd rather decline marrying. Whatever it is that he can neglect for the spiritual welfare of those in Corinth or anywhere else, Paul will abstain from those things. And so that's what he is counseling here in Romans chapter 14, is if your brother's relationship with God is going to be harmed, then you refrain from that participation. So, picking up in verse 15, 4, if because of food your brother is hurt, you're no longer walking according to love. Do not destroy with your food him for whom Christ died. Therefore, do not let what is for you a good thing be spoken of as evil. For the kingdom of God is not eating and drinking, but righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. For he who in this way serves Christ is acceptable to God and approved by men. So then we pursue the things which make for peace and the building up of one another. Well, as we look at verses 15 through 19, first of all, the idea is that we're talking about something that you can do without. Like you can give this thing up. And we're talking about something that is so small in comparison, right? The way Paul puts it, you would destroy your brother for whom Christ has died for meat. Why would you do that? And so set this small thing aside for the sake of your brother. And notice again, destroy. We're not talking about differences in preference We're talking about someone who is going to be, you're going to participate in the destruction of their faith by doing whatever it is that you're doing, by eating the meat, by disdaining the celebration of days, whatever the case may be. He goes back. Do not, therefore, let what is for you a good thing. All right, that's bringing it back into that context. Once again, it is a good thing for you, but it's not a good thing for him. And so you can do something that is good in and of itself and it become evil in that sense. For the kingdom, he says, is not eating and drinking. Where's our focus? Our focus is love for our brother, and that ought to be the foundations of how we behave towards our brother. Now, in some sense, that will inform the aggravation factor, right? If I'm doing something, I'm saying, well, I know this gets under his skin, so I'm just going to do it anyway. Well, I don't think necessarily that's offense, but it's not good, right? So we don't purposefully go out of our way or purposefully frustrate our brethren. But again, in this context, what we're talking about is putting that stumbling block, that means of destruction to their faith in their way. Well, coming down to verse 20 then, he says, do not tear down the work of God for the sake of food. All things indeed are clean, but they are evil for the man who eats and gives offense. All right, so on the one hand, we have something that is clean in and of itself, but becomes unclean because of what this person thinks. Similarly, here's something that is appropriate to do for you, the one who does not think it's unclean. And so it's clean for you unless, again, what that brother thinks comes into play. And then it actually can become sin for you. It can become evil for you. So it can become unclean for him because of what he thinks, and it can become unclean for you because of what he thinks. And so we have to take that into consideration. Now, when we're looking at a chapter like Romans 14, where there's instruction on both sides, and both people need to be taking the other brother into consideration, what people do most often is they come armed with the instruction for the other person. So, for instance, in a marriage, a husband comes armed with the command for submission and tells his wife, you ought to submit. And a wife comes armed with the instruction of love and care and tells her husband, you're supposed to love me and live in understanding and so forth. And nobody really leans on and thinks about the instruction towards their own selves. And so the husband doesn't meditate and contemplate on the sacrificial love. The wife doesn't contemplate and meditate on the submission, but they're both very strong on the instruction towards the other. Romans 14 definitely comes out that way. So that the weaker brother is constantly waving his conscience like a flag. And he's not acting very weak. In fact, he usually is coming on pretty strong and telling everybody how they ought to do it his way. They're not paying attention to the do not condemn part, which is the very part that Paul gives to them. So you see, Paul provides instruction for the weaker brother in case the stronger brother doesn't do what the weaker brother would like him to do. He says, here's what you do to avoid stumbling. Then the stronger brother, he comes in and he's armed with that you don't condemn me, I have a right to do this language, and runs right past the you be willing to surrender your liberties for the sake of your brother, runs right past that and says, and rather leans on his liberties. And so both people are instructing the other one, and no one is taking the instruction for themselves. And I feel so much like it is in the home, when children aren't getting along, when spouses aren't getting along, and so often the answer is that nobody is worrying about themselves, and everybody's worried about the other. But here Paul gives instructions to each of us towards the other, and it all falls to pieces if all we hear is the instruction to the other guy. If everybody is yielding like they ought to, and if everybody, including the weak brother, is motivated by love, why then this doesn't turn into the storm that it so easily can. And there is a yielding in both directions, and that people are working hard to be peaceable, to be at peace with all men. Going back to chapter 12 and verse 18, that's the instruction. As much as is within you, what can you do? What is it possible for you to do to be at peace with your brethren? And I think sometimes what comes into our mind is, well, I know one thing that would be possible is if he would do this. That's not what he said. What's it possible for you to do to be at peace with all men? And so that's still what we're really talking about here in chapter 14. So don't tear down the work of God for the sake of food. It is good not to eat meat or to drink wine or to do anything by which your brother stumbles. There again is that language of stumbling. The faith which you have, he says, have as your own conviction before God. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves. But he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because his eating is not from faith, and whatever is not from faith is sin. So, whatever is not from faith is sin. There's a couple of ideas there. I think the word confidence, we used this in a sermon a few weeks ago. Confidence comes from two Latin roots. So con is with, and then fide is faith. Confidence is with faith. We know what the word confidence means to us in the English language. Is the idea of being sure or certain about something. And I think that goes well here in this last verse of chapter 14. That act with confidence. And where you do not have confidence, do not act. Where it is not with faith, in other words, where you are not certain about this activity. Now, bringing in some other ideas about faith that we've talked about, faithfulness and loyalty and allegiance. If this is not something that you are certain about in your allegiance and in your loyalty to the king, will the king be pleased with this? And if I don't know that, if I can't act with faithful loyalty to him in this, why then I don't participate in this. If I'm uncertain, I don't participate in this. Oh, that would be our metric, that would be our standard of behavior. When we're growing up, when our parents are away, we have sort of two guiding mindsets. One is, I'm not sure what mom and dad would say about this, so since I'm not sure, since they haven't certainly explicitly said no, then I'm going to go ahead and do this. Or, I don't know what mom and dad would think about that. I'm not going to do that. Well, I'll just be honest. I generally took the first approach. When it comes to our relationships with authority, when it comes to our parents, and when it comes to God, our behavior certainly should be, I am not certain what the master would think about this. And so I ought to abstain. I ought to stay away from that until I am either certain that it is all right. And if that day never comes, why then I will indefinitely abstain from that thing. So that is what acting with faith means. And it's all in one direction. Okay? So this would counsel the weaker brother's behavior until you get confidence. I say it's all in one direction. There was a situation I was talking to a young lady about 20 years ago or more. And we were talking about the appropriateness of going to some school function on a day when we would have been having an assembly. And she was planning on doing that. And I said, do you feel good about that? And I said, let me ask it this way. If you neglected the school activity and went to the assembly, are you certain that would be right? And she said, yes, I know there would be nothing wrong with doing that. And I said, are you certain that going to the school event would be appropriate, that would be a good decision? She goes, I'm not as certain. And I said, all right. And I said, well, then you ought to go, in this direction. And you ought to go to the assembly. And I used this passage. And she said, well, now that says, if it is not from faith, it is sin. And so I am not, and so I would be going to church because of my uncertainty about this other thing. So I would be acting in uncertainty. And she just really twisted that around so that going to church would actually be on the basis of a lack of faith or a lack of confidence. No, you have two decisions. One of them is right. One of them you're not sure is right. Do what you know is right. That's the idea here. Act with confidence. And if you have two paths or more, and one or more of those paths you are uncertain about, you stay away, take those off the list. You go down the path that you know is right. And if we are constantly behaving in that way, then we will be more confident and more certain in our relationship with God. Well, I think that's the notions there in chapter 14. I think those are some of the constraining principles in chapter 14. And I hope that that's helpful. I think there's a lot of application. I think sometimes we struggle for application and we use some maybe outdated ideas that don't apply to us anymore. I think we've got a lot of ways to apply this right now, as I suggested in the article from Sunday's bulletin. I think that everybody needs to be thinking about how these things applies to themselves as we move forward. And we do strive to remember that God is the judge of all these things, and I am not. Well, in a few brief moments here at the end of this class, let's start back at chapter 1. In Romans chapter 1, we open up the book, and I want to suggest to you that in our minds, I don't want us to jump just too quickly to the Gentiles are in sin, because I think Paul establishes from the beginning some notions about who Jesus is. He is King. He is the risen Lord. And it is faith in him, faithfulness to him, faithfulness in response to his faithfulness that will be the foundations of everything else that is written in this book. And so he leans in on that on the first half of chapter 1. We sort of skip over the introduction, but I think the introduction lays a lot of groundwork. And it sort of culminates there in verses 16 and 17. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation. Remember that word power used back in verse 4, referencing the resurrection. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed, from faith to faith. Remember, we talked about that back from the book of Habakkuk, where God's faithfulness has been displayed, and he's calling on Habakkuk for his faithfulness in response, and as far as waiting on God. And we see that idea throughout the book. Faithfulness to faithfulness. His faithfulness, our faithfulness in response. It's a reciprocal aspect. The righteous shall live by faith. That being the quote there from Habakkuk. All right. So we start off with Jesus is King, and loyalty to him, allegiance to him is the foundation of our salvation. Coming into the rest of chapter 1, he turns towards defining the problem. The problem is rebellion and sin. It is rampant among the Gentiles. And if I am correct in my assumptions about the book of Romans, it is to a Jewish and Gentile congregation, but one in which the Jewish brethren seem to be pressing the law and the need to adhere to the law on the Gentile brethren. So if that's correct, then as he's going through defining the sin in the Gentile world, the Jews would be very much in agreement with that. And so that if his bent of this message is towards the Jews, then even the sin of the Gentiles is leaned in that direction. It's not that it says nothing to the Gentiles, but it certainly would say something to the Jews, who would say, yes, that's it. Exactly, that's what we're saying. But then he turns in chapter 2 and says, you also. And in fact, you worse, because you have the law, because you know you've had this centuries-long relationship with God, and yet here you are participating in sin and in ways that is as bad and worse than the Gentiles. Chapter 3, we have several quotations from the Psalms and Isaiah talking about the universal sin of mankind. But really, when we go back and look at the context, it's not talking about the universal sin of mankind, but rather it is describing who people are who have rejected God. Here are rebels from God, and here's what they look like. David is writing those things. He's not writing them about himself. He's saying, here are God's enemies. Here's what they look like. Well, he applies that to everyone. And most importantly, and especially right here in the context coming from chapter 2, he's applying it to the Jews. He's saying, there's no one righteous, no, not one. That means you. You're among that number. You're of those who have rebelled and rejected God. And so, yes, all have sinned. But I think that especially includes and is pointed towards the Jews who didn't think that they fell into that number. Chapter 4 then, he says, faith is the foundation. Faithfulness is the foundation. And he points to Abraham. And he says that is the basis of Abraham's relationship with God. He points to David. That is the foundation of David's relationship with God. Circumcision was not even present when Abraham began to build that relationship to God. When God pronounced him righteous, it was before circumcision came onto the scene, but not before faithfulness did. Faithfulness had been there from the beginning of the relationship when Abraham first left his home in Ur, the Chaldees, and went to a land which God would show him. The law was present in David's time, but it did not provide a sacrifice for David's sin. And so David's appeal to God is not on the basis of law, but rather on the basis of God's mercy that is not provided for in the law specifically. Now, the law points to God's mercy, and David would have Exodus chapter 34, for instance, to appeal to. But Exodus chapter 34 and God's mercy, again, is not based on Leviticus, for instance. Exodus chapter 34 is God providing mercy that is apart from what the law would provide. And so David is an example of a relationship on the basis of faithfulness. He returns to God in faithfulness, and he appeals to God on the basis of that for mercy and kindness in response to his sins. So, faith is the answer. But faithfulness toward whom? Well, chapter 5 introduces the man that our faithfulness is directed towards. We have Adam, whose path we've all been walking in. Ever since Adam, everyone has been making the same decisions and it results in the same consequence. That is, death spread to all men because all men sin. But there's another option. Jesus has come along as a new Adam, as a new man, and he is created in the image of God, just as Adam was in the image of God. But the difference is he actually is the very express image of God. And he comes not created in the same way as Adam, but rather he comes already existing, but takes on the form of man and lives a life that gives us a different path and that leads, of course, to a different result. We can keep following and giving loyalty and faithfulness to Adam. We all have. We've all been faithful to Adam. Or we can move our faithfulness from Adam over to the new man, that is Christ. And that results in resurrection, which is chapter 6. Chapter 6 is Jesus has died and has been raised. And in baptism, we have died with him and we have been raised with him. And so our lives should reflect the resurrection. It should reflect a death and resurrection and a newness of life. And so he calls on the Christians there in Rome to reflect that, for their lives to be instructive about Jesus's death and resurrection. Chapter 7, then, he turns back to the law. And he says, now look, the law has provided a lot of things for us. And it's defined a lot of things, and it's helped us to understand and to know what sin is. But it does not ultimately give us a path out of sin, except in Christ. That he is the one who gives us the path outside of Christ. If we're looking at the law, and especially if we're looking at the law on its surface, and we're seeing just commands to follow, things to abstain from, things to adhere to, then that's all that's going to give us is frustration. And so there's got to be something that releases us from the guilt, that releases us from the shame that comes along with sin. There's got to be the thing that got David released from his guilt and his shame, and in fact the consequences of his sin, and that is faithfulness towards God, leading to mercy from God, that is apart from the law. Chapter 8, he goes into this discussion of the physical and the spiritual, the carnal and the spiritual, the flesh. And the flesh, I believe, is that view of the law that holds on to the law, that really ignores the lawgiver that's right here and thinks, I can do this. And he's saying that leads to destruction, that leads to death. We already know that. But a spiritual mindset looks upwards towards God, has the eternal perspective, and therefore leads to life. And he goes from that and transitions in chapter 8 to that spiritual mindset is not only going to lead to life hereafter, but it is going to give us the means by which we can meet the difficulties and the persecutions that come in this life. As he gets into that part towards the end of chapter 8. Then coming into chapter 9, there is a real transition, a focus very much on the Jews and what's going to happen to them. And this discussion of, is this fair? Is this just what God is pronouncing is going to happen to Jerusalem, to the Jewish nation? Is it right for him to judge them? And Paul lays out, it is very just. In fact, it is mercy that they are even still existing. God should have wiped them out a long time ago by rights of justice. But he had plans to accomplish. He's accomplished those plans. And now that he has, there is no need to continue holding on to the Jewish nation. That brings us into chapter 10. Chapter 10 is that sort of supposed response. We didn't know any better. And Paul goes through in chapter 10, says you absolutely should have known better. If you didn't know better, then shame on you. Somehow the Gentiles know better, and they've just now come into awareness of these things. Israel as a nation has always known these things, and in fact has always rejected these things. Then in chapter 11, so you're saying no Jews can be saved? Paul says, that's not what I'm saying at all. In fact, I'm saved. In fact, just like Elijah, there are 7,000 who have not yet bowed the knee to Baal. And so there are many Jews who are saved. But how are they saved? And then he goes through illustrating with this tree where the branches are broken off. And then the branches are grafted back in. Particularly those Gentile branches of the wild olive tree are grafted in to this olive tree. So then he turns to the Jews and says, how are you going to be saved? Same way. You're going to have to be grafted in. But they don't think they should be grafted in. They think they're already a part. That's the whole problem. You see, that's the problem, is that they think that they're already part of the olive tree. They don't know they've been broken off. And Paul says, you have. And then they say, well, if we've been broken off, then what can we do? These guys over here, they broke off of the wild olive tree and grafted into this one. You can do the same. You can be regrafted in to the olive tree, and you can be saved as well. How can we be saved? Well, starting in chapter 12, you can sacrifice. That is, sacrifice self. You can be holy, be separate and apart. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. You can love your brother, love your neighbor. And he goes on to instruct about how to love the neighbor, and he does that specifically in chapter 12. He talks about judgment and condemnation at the end of chapter 12, or rather vengeance. And then he turns to the government and says that's their role, and your role is to yield to them and let them be the instrument of God's vengeance here in this life. And then he turns back and says, but you love one another and so fulfill the law. And so this pushing towards the Jews, saying it's not in the law, at least not in the way you think. And then coming back in chapters 12 and 13 and saying that in a sense, it is in the law, just not like you think. It's in the law from the standpoint of Christ is the end of the law. Christ is the goal of the law, as it says back in chapter 10. And so if we see the law from the perspective of what it teaches us about Christ, why then it is still helpful in our relationship to God. But that is a vision of the law that is on the basis of faithfulness to Him, not faithfulness to the law in and of itself. That's, I think, what perverted their mind towards the law. And so love your brother. Love your brother in these specific ways, chapter 14. How does that play out? Well, it plays out like this. He doesn't feel like he can do some of the things that you know that are permitted by God. Don't look down on him for that. Or you still hold on to some things that you still want to do in a way to honor God, celebrating these days, holding them in honor. Don't judge your brother because he doesn't do that. Don't think you're more spiritual because of that. Here's some specific ways in which you can begin to break down the walls of division and exercise love towards your brother. Chapter 15 continues on that line, talking about what we would give up for the sake of our brethren. And then chapter 16 finally gets into some lengthy greetings and farewells and pointing out all the people that he knows, all the acquaintances that he has in Rome. And we'll talk about some of those as we look at chapters 15 and 16 over the next couple of classes. I hope that's a helpful review as you're going through. I'm trying to think of the string. How does this move along? As you're studying the book of Romans, chapter content is good, and I encourage that. But think of chapter content from the standpoint of connectors. How does this move the arguments along that Paul is making as we're working through the book? I don't think that this is a scattered approach. I do think it's a building approach, and that he's building one argument on top of another, leading to this conclusion, which is the unification, the breakdown of the divisions between the Jewish and Gentile brethren in Rome. Well, that brings us to a conclusion for this class. We'll pick up in chapter 15, Lord willing, this Sunday, and hope to see you there. Hope everybody is getting well and or is well, and that we'll be able to enjoy our time back together, and that we'll be able to move forward and finish up this book together in our next class. Thank you so much, and God bless.